السلام عليكم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد سيد الأولين والآخرين. مدد يا رسول الله، مدد يا سادات أصحاب الرسول، مدد يا مشايخ دستور مولانا شيخ الله فاز أصلا شيخ محمد قال مدد طريقتنا الصحبة والخير في الجميع. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الله مع الذين اتقوا والذين هم محسنون. صدق الله العظيم. Allah Azze ve Celle Allah'tan, Allah Azze ve Celle'den korkandan ihsan edenlerle beraberdir diyor. Allah Azze ve Celle
Allah Almighty says, be with those who are fearful of Allah Almighty, and be with those who present in the name of Allah Almighty.
En başka korkulacak şey yok. Allah Azze ve Celle korkmak demek.
There's nothing else to be afraid of except Allah Almighty. What does it mean to be afraid of Allah Almighty?
Onun istediğini yapmaktır.
To be afraid of Allah Almighty means to do what He, Allah Almighty, wants us to do.
Çünkü onun istemediğini yaparsan o vakit badbahtsın.
If you do not do what He wants you to do, then you are an unlucky person.
İşlerin zahirde yürüse bile
And even if you are then still successful in this world,
ahiret işinin durmuş olur.
you will be unsuccessful in the hereafter, and you will be a loser in the hereafter.
Sana günahlar yazılmış olur.
And you will have collected sins in your account.
Onun için Allah'tan korkmak mümin için lazım olan şeydir.
To be afraid of Allah Almighty is what characterizes a believer.
Allah'tan kork. İnsanlar artık zamanda Allah'tan korkan çok azdır.
Today there are only a few people who are afraid or conscious of Allah Almighty.
Allah'tan korkmayınca ne oluyor?
And what is the result if people are no longer afraid of Allah Almighty?
Allah'tan korkmayınca her şeyden korkuyor insan.
The moment you are no longer afraid of Allah Almighty, you will become afraid of everything else.
Korkulmayacak şeyden korkuyorlar.
And then people are afraid of things which they should not be afraid of.
Korkacağınız emri olan şeyden Allah Azze ve Celle'den
What we should be afraid of is to not fulfill Allah Almighty's commands.
Korkmuyorlar.
But people are not afraid of not fulfilling Allah Almighty's commands.
Kabadayılık yapıyorlar. Biz tanımayız, etmeyiz diye.
Instead, they stand up against their Lord Allah Almighty and they say we do not accept what He has declared.
Öyle yapınca da her şeyden korkuyorlar.
But the moment they are no longer afraid of Allah Almighty, they become afraid of all other things.
Hiçbir şeyden emin değiller.
They do not have confidence or security at all.
Hiçbir şeyden memnun değiller.
They are never satisfied or happy with anything.
Şimdi ne olacak, ne oldu, ne olacak filan.
They are constantly afraid of what is going to happen. They are constantly in a state of anxiety of what is going to come next.
Öyle olunca teslimiyet de gitmiş oluyor.
They have lost their confidence in Allah Almighty, and they are no longer in a state of surrendering to the will of Allah Almighty.
Hiçbir şey onları korkularından emin edemiyor, yani korkularından.
And as they have lost this trust in Allah Almighty, there's nothing that protects them or that guarantees them and preserves them from what they are afraid of.
Kurtaramıyor.
and they cannot be saved from what they are afraid of.
Bu zamanın insanlarıdır çoğu insanın.
And this is what this is the state most people find themselves in today's time.
Bu korkudan dolayı bazıları evden çıkmıyor, bazıları
Because of this fear and of this anxiety, there are people who do not leave their houses.
ne yapacağını şaşırmış.
People do not know what to do.
Halbuki çare Allah Azze ve Celle önlerine koymuş.
But the remedy has been put right in front of them by Allah Almighty.
Allah'tan korkun.
The remedy is to be fearful of Allah Almighty.
Allah'tan korkarsanız kimseden korkmazsınız.
If you are afraid of Allah Almighty, then you will be not afraid of anything.
Ne kimseden korkarsınız, ne hiçbir şeyden korkarsınız. Bu bana böyle yapacak, bu benim işim olacak.
But as they are not afraid of Allah Almighty, they are afraid of anything else. They are afraid of people. They are afraid of what people are going to do against them. They are afraid of how their business will develop.
Bu ne gideceğim yer, okuyacağım imtihandır.
They are afraid of the places they go to. They are afraid of the exams.
Buydu filan.
They are afraid of so many things.
Onlardan hiçbir şeyden korkmazsınız ki Allah Azze ve Celle'nin istediği oluyor diye.
But since they are not afraid of Allah Almighty, they do not have trust in Allah Almighty, and they have lost the confidence that everything happens through the will of Allah Almighty.
Öteki türlü her şeyden daha evden dışarı adım atmadan korkmaya başlıyor. Evin
They are afraid of even making a single step out of their houses.
içinde korkuyor.
They are afraid even within their houses.
Her yürüdüğü adımda korkusu var.
They are afraid of every single step they take.
Onun için Allah'la beraber olun.
Therefore, be with Allah Almighty.
Allah'la beraber olan korkmaz.
Those who are with Allah Almighty will not be afraid.
İnna Allah ma'allezine takav diyor. Allah ondan korkanla beraberdir diyor Allah Azze ve Celle.
Allah Almighty is with those who are fearful of Him.
Allah seninle beraber olduktan sonra neye korkacaksın?
And if you are with Allah Almighty, and if Allah Almighty is with you, why should you be afraid of anything?
Korkacak bir şey kalmıyor artık.
There's nothing to be afraid of anymore.
Allah bizi ondan korkanlardan eylesin ki
May Allah Almighty make us become those who are fearful of Him.
Bilelim, hata yapmayalım, kusur yap.
So that we are in awareness and consciousness of Allah Almighty, so that we do not commit a mistake, so that we do not commit a sin or do something against Allah Almighty.
Günah yapmayalım inşallah.
May Allah Almighty protect us from coming up against Him and from committing sins.
Allah tevfik. El Fatiha.